Hello again. There is a thriving industry, which some viewers might have come across on the internet, devoted to fabricating a history of ideas and inventions which black people supposedly came up with, and whose credit for such things was promptly stolen by unscrupulous white folk. The electric light bulb, invented by an African American and pinched by Edison. Blood banks, another African American first. You get the idea, I'm sure. None of these claims has any substance, but since the Black Lives Matter movement came to prominence a few years ago, there is a marked reluctance to challenge such fantasies, the sensitivities of black people being very easily bruised, you understand. They may seem brash and even aggressive on the outside, but deep inside they're sensitive little flowers. When the Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood closed down a few years ago to be refurbished in a more modern style, I was, like many people, apprehensive of how it would turn out when it reopened. It has now been opened as the Young V&A rather than the Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood. I went there yesterday, and I'm bound to say it wasn't quite as bad as I had expected. There's still a good deal to look at that is interesting. What I found really annoying, though, was the inaccuracies and the propaganda in the descriptions of the articles on display. I mean, it's a museum, for heaven's sake, a branch of the Victoria and Albert Museum in South Kensington. You'd think they could at least get the labels on the exhibits right. A tin plate battery-powered moon rover from the 1960s, for instance, has NASA emblazoned on the side with the logo of that organisation. The label, though, claims that this is from 1955. Quite apart from the style of the thing clearly being from the 60s, NASA wasn't even established until 1958. Still, enough pedantry. There is a Viewmaster on show in one of the cases, with the surprising information that it was actually invented by a black man. I knew at once that this was not true, but that a photograph of the African American in question, Charles Harrison, had actually been placed there to make black people visiting the museum feel good about themselves. The Charles Harrison inventing the Viewmaster myth was launched just before his death in 2018. I give a link to an obituary from the British newspaper The Independent, which relates the fictitious story that in 1958 Charles Harrison redesigned the Viewmaster, which had been around for 20 years or so. We learn that in 1958 he oversaw an update of the Viewmaster's chunky 1938 design, turning the 3D transparency viewer, which up till then had been largely confined to professional use in photographic studios, into a must-have toy. Well, that's absolute nonsense. The 1938 design had been phased out well over a decade earlier. In the thumbnail to this video, you can see the 1955 version of the Viewmaster, which, except for the colour, is identical to later versions. It was a hugely popular toy throughout the whole of the 1950s. It wasn't turned into a must-have toy by Charles Harrison at all. This is just one instance of what the Museum of Childhood is up to. I saw many others. It is being used to put across false and inaccurate information to children, and those running it think that if they can only pretend that black people invented some of the toys there, then more black families will visit the museum. Viewers might like to ask themselves how many black people they see in the average London museum, apart from visitors from overseas. I doubt that the Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood will be able to buck this trend.